On the show today, Steven Kotler. So Steven is Mr. Flow. I have had a strong interest in this topic before I even know what it was called. You know, I did a few seasons snowboarding and I was like, why do I like this so much? Why do I keep getting up early even when I'm hungover to drag my ass out into the cold? And the same with martial arts. Most listeners know about my aikido background. Why did I spend so much time doing something that wasn't really necessary from a practical point of view? But yeah, I got a feeling from I didn't get anywhere else. And so, I've been interested in this literature for a while. And Steven's books, The Rise of Superman, for example, I really liked. He's got a new one coming out called The Art of the Impossible. And someone really recently said to me, why did you do this big, huge 500,000 conference? And I said, well, I'm not really interested in the possible. So I wanted something that was impossible. And there's a kind of a macho thing to say, but there's some truth in that. It kind of excited me that there's something that was a huge challenge that we had to be sort of superhuman in a way to pull it off. And Steven was at the conference. His presentation was, really eloquent, really well thought of. So very happy to have him back today. So Steven, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Let's hear a bit about your personal story. How did you personally get interested in flow?
I walked into the door of journalism. I was a writer, and I got into magazine journalism in the early 1990s. And back then, action sports were just getting going. So snowboarding, skiing, the like, and gravity games were happening, and the X Games were just starting to get going. And there weren't a whole lot of journalists around who, this was back at a time these sports were really subcultural. So there weren't a lot of journalists around who could actually surf and write or, ski and write, and I could do those things, not very well, but I was lucky enough to spend the better portion of about a decade chasing professional action sport athletes around mountains and across oceans. And what I saw during that period was astounding. There were more so-called impossible feats, things that had never been done and were believed to never going to be done, being done, that like it was just mind-bending. I mean, the examples are everywhere. At the start of that period, the biggest jump anybody thought a skier could handle or a snowboarder could handle was 70 feet. They thought the human body, that was the upper threshold for impact. And it's now closing in on 300 feet, right? The double backflip or the single backflip on a motorcycle. Nobody, right? This has been a forever thing. Surfing a wave over 25 feet. People have been trying to do this for almost 1,000 years. And yet, 2 decades later, surfers are routinely pulling into waves that are 100 feet tall, right? 100 plus at this point. And so more impossible was going on in these sports than ever before. And I wanted to know why. And really what caught my attention, it wasn't just that I was seeing the impossible being accomplished over and over and over again. It's that action adventure sport athletes, especially in the early 1990s, were this like rowdy, irreverent punk rock group of people. There was a lot of drugs. There was a lot of crazy behavior. There was very little education, right? The people I knew had very little education. They had very little money. Most of them came from horrific childhoods, broken homes, bad situations. These are people that everybody in the world would have bet against. Like, who's going to fail? These people, right?
That was me and my friends. Yeah.
Right? And yet here, these same people were redefining the limits of our species over and over and over again at a rate that had been unmatched in history. And I wanted to know what the hell was going on. I was dying to understand it. I should also tell you that personally, if you spend all your time chasing pro athletes around mountains and across oceans, you're not a pro athlete. I'm a writer. You're going to break things. I broke everything, like 70 broken bones along the way. And so I knew after a bunch of years in this, sort of as I was pushing towards my 30s, that if I didn't take this question of how do you accomplish the impossible, which had become sort of the central focus of my life, out of action sports and into other domains, I was going to probably kill myself. So like, that's essentially what I did over the next 30 years is I took this question of what are 20 years, what does it take to accomplish the impossible into, science, into technology, into culture, into on and on and on and on. And I wrote books about what I discovered. So that's essentially like my life in a nutshell is, I'm just a guy who's weird enough to think that there's a formula for impossible and to use the tools of psychology and neuroscience to try to track it down for 30 years and write books about what I discovered along the way.
And you're incredibly well read as well. I mean, I was listening to your Sounds True presentation, and you're jumping between sort of Nietzsche and, things. And I'm like, wow, like this is psychology is my field. And I'm just about trying, James, William James, and all these kind of historical figures in the flow world, and then bringing that right up to date with kind of cognitive neuroscience and whether the prefrontal cortex is offline when people are doing this. I mean, there's a huge spectrum in what you write about.
There is. Yes, and I like. And to take it one step further, anytime you see the impossible become possible, I always say you see two things, right? You see people learning how to take advantage of accelerating disruptive technology, and people learning how to extend human capability. So I've written 6 books on the technology side and 6 books on the human capability side. And as you pointed out, I have a background in philosophy. I mean, a long time ago, a minor, it's not a huge background in philosophy, but and if you want to start studying modern peak performance, the story starts with Nietzsche. I do a little bit of this. I tell the story out loud in the audiobook you listen to, and in The Art of Impossible, you get a little bit of that story actually in print. But like, people don't realize this, but Nietzsche was the first guy. Psychology was just happening. Evolution happened, right? And Darwin came along and gave us a theory of, here's how life develops based on biology. And Nietzsche and a bunch of other people said, hey, wait a minute. Like, if our bodies evolve, our minds evolve too. And if we're going to understand and optimize, Nietzsche was very interested in peak performance and optimizing our psychology, we have to start with biology. And so I start with Nietzsche because that's, it's 150 years later at the Flow Research Collective, which is the company I run. That's exactly what we do, right? We train about 1,000 people a month using a neuroscience-based peak performance training. And the only thing we do is teach people to get the biology to work for them rather than against them. So you start the story with Nietzsche because I think that's sort of where it starts. But yeah, I like the full story. I've read a lot. So do you want the rude version of this? This is the rude version.
You can.
Here's the rude version of this.
The full rude version.
Smart people have a word for people who don't read books. Dumb.
I was going to go for muggles, but yeah.
Right. Dumb. I mean, that's just the flat truth of the matter. I mean, like, I wasn't all that. I didn't have a lot of natural tools. I didn't come into this world with a ton of talent. And so, but what I learned is I could outread the competition, and I could learn more than other people by simply reading more books.
Interesting.
I learned early on, they hide it in books.
So on the one hand, you've got these, this pursuit of a very experiential, very, I was around snowboarders a couple of winters, and not a lot of reading necessarily going on, a lot of partying. A lot of experience, a lot of like, hey, you've got to taste it. It's in the experience, it's in the subjective. But then on the other hand, you've got the kind of other piece of the objective research, the kind of literature around it, the philosophy behind it. So this kind of bringing together two things that aren't always coexisting there.
It is true. I, take the story one step further to go where you started. I very quickly realized that the state of flow, right, the optimal state of consciousness, was what was underpinning all these impossible feats. Like, when we talk about extending human capability, we're talking about a suite of tools, right? It's not just flow, but flow is at the center of all of it, because flow is optimal performance, right? It's when we feel our best, when we perform our best. It's how evolution shaped human beings for peak performance. It's universal. We can all do it, right? So to understand flow, you want more flow. The psychologists, no disrespect, had a rough time of it. Trying to use the psychology to train flow. If you go back to the sort of 1990s, right, there's a literature of this, and it's hit or miss. We're not very good at it. We get better at it in the 2000s because the neuroscience gives us mechanism, right? If you understand how it works in the brain, you have a basic biological mechanism. You turn it up, you turn it down. It's a whole lot more to work with. It makes training flow more reliable. That's where the neuroscience sort of came in. So like, there was the only way I could make sense of what these men and women were doing in action sports was through the neuroscience. Now, as a journalist, I had an advantage in that I was also covering science, right? Those were my twin loves, was science and technology and action sports, basically. So I covered everything. I mean, I wrote the music column for GQ magazine for 5 years and blah, blah. I did a lot of stuff, but like my principal loves were science and action sports. So you're right.
You're kind of like, I read often your work here as sort of like someone who's pretty geeky, but also has an ear for the sexy, like adventure sports. You know, it's pretty attractive. I mean, it's not quite as cool as it once was. It's a bit more common, but it's pretty sexy. It's pretty exciting. And even neuroscience is kind of, you know, it's kind of the sexy mind crack of kind of a lot of coaches and trainers I know out there. You know, a lot of Buddhists now, meditation friends of mine, tell them about neuroscience. They kind of light up, show them a blob of a brain with a blob of color on, and they're convinced by anything. You know, there's even a word for that, blobology. And, you know, you do have, like, Steven, I don't want to give you shit here, but let's be honest, you do have a pretty, like, an ear for the sexy as well, right?
Well, I don't think of it that way. So let me put it to you. I have a very good talent for finding the cutting edge of any situation. There's a lot of shit I can't do. So like, let me put this, like when I was in school, if you gave me, I'm an English major. I have an English major as an undergraduate. I have a really hard time understanding most of the classics of literature. Like literally, like you put give me a Thomas Hardy book or something along those lines.
It's boring. Thomas Hardy's boring.
Right. But if you give me James Joyce or Thomas Pynchon or David Foster Wallace, my brain works that way. I naturally understand that stuff. That's how my brain sort of is. And so that's sort of a cutting, that's just a nose for the cutting, I call it a nose for the cutting edge and wherever I am, it's just what works for me. It's not, so I'm not trying to be sexy. And in fact, the way I tell it to my team when we have to do a lot of, we do PR, we do marketing, we do all that stuff. And I said, look, I need you guys around because I'm a guy who can't find the mainstream with two hands and a flashlight. Like I have no idea where the rest of the world is. Before I teamed up with Peter Diamandis and he pointed me in the direction of the world. I had written 4 cult classics in 4 different genres. Do you know how impossible that is? Like, do you know how just crazy that is? I missed the mainstream. I mean, trust me, I was trying to sell as many books as possible. I missed the fucking mainstream 4 times in 4 different directions.
I don't believe you 100%. You're a great salesman. You tell, and I don't mean that as an insult. Like I
am a great salesman now.
Okay.
After 35 years of having people around me pointing me where I need to go, I fell into magazine journalism because I had dreadlocks down to the middle of my butt and, as an old punk rocker, and nobody would fucking hire me in mainstream corporate world. You know what I mean?
I'd hire you now.
No, but I mean, like I was working, before I went to grad school in writing, I was working at Foot Cone and Belding. Advertising, right? Cool, cutting edge advertising shop back in the 90s. I was doing some freelance stuff. They'd never met me. I got out of grad school thinking I was going to walk right back into a job there. And I had to go into the office to fill out forms this time. And they took one look at me. And I'm like, yeah, if I could forget about it. So like, at the time, magazine journalism was sort of the only place that would have me.
You were hiding behind that. And, okay.